So as we can see from this video, it was in the year 1962 that NASA finally decided to fake it rather than try and make it. And it was at the end of '64, beginning of '65, just a few months after Khrushchev was taken out of power, and a few months before the beginning of the Vietnam War, that the Russians were told that NASA was going to be faking a moon landing, and they were not to be blowing the whistle on it. An agreement they still keep to this day, with the two sides merely being pawns on the chessboard in the bankers' controlled opposition wars. So as we can see from this video, it was in the year 1962 that NASA finally decided to fake it rather than try and make it. And it was at the end of '64, beginning of '65, just a few months after Khrushchev was taken out of power, and a few months before the beginning of the Vietnam War, that the Russians were told that NASA was going to be faking a moon landing, and they were not to be blowing the whistle on it.
It's called Sputnik.
We know. Sit down.
From day one, the Soviet Union conducted its space program in complete secrecy. Successful missions were made public after their completion. Failures were kept secret. It's why so much of what happened in the Soviet space program didn't come to light until after 1993. In contrast, the US decided to conduct its space program completely in the open, and in front of the world's media. Largely forgotten by history was the first manned Apollo mission, Apollo 7. On October 11, 1968, it took Schirra, Easel and Cunningham into Earth orbit for nearly 11 days. Despite some issues, the mission proved the flight worthiness of both the command and service modules. The follow-up mission to Apollo 7 was Apollo 8, originally intended to be a second test of the command and service module, as well as the lunar module in Earth orbit. This plan was changed in August of 1968 after US spy satellites saw something big sitting on a Soviet launch site. The sight of the Soviet N-1 moon rocket sitting on its launch pad left US authorities convinced that the Soviets were about to launch a manned mission to the moon, a mission that may also have included a manned lunar landing. Despite the extreme risk involved, it was decided to send Apollo 8, without a lunar module, to orbit the moon. If nothing else, the US could claim to have symbolically reached the moon first, even if the Soviets landed before the US. The crew of Apollo 8 were the first humans to pass through the Van Allen radiation belts, receiving 1 mg of radiation, or about the same as a single chest X-ray. Apollo 8 reached the moon on December 24, 1968, and orbited the moon 10 times, before returning to Earth, and splashing down on December 27, 1968. The mission of Apollo 9 now became the original Apollo 8 mission. The testing of the lunar module in Earth orbit, Gumdrop and Spider were docked, then undocked, then flown apart, then together, and the descent stage dropped. Next came Apollo 10, a complete rehearsal of the Apollo 11 mission, which included everything, except an actual landing. Then on July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Edwin E. Aldrin Jr., flying the lunar module Eagle, landed on the moon at 20 hours, 17 minutes, and 40 seconds, UTC.
They're pegged on horizontal velocity. 300 feet down, 3.5. 47 forward. Put up. On 1.5 down. 70. Got big shadow out there. 50 down at 2.5. 19 forward. Altitude, velocity, light. 3.5 down. 220 feet. 13 forward. 11 forward, coming down nicely. 200 feet. 4.5 down. 5.5 down. 160 feet. 6.5 down. 5.5 down. 9 forward. Good. 120 feet. 100 feet. 3.5 down. 9 forward. 5%. 185. Okay, 75 feet. Car's looking good. Down a half. 6 forward. 60 seconds. Lights on. 6. Down 2.5. Forward. Forward. That's 40 feet down 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drifting to the right a little. Down a half. 30 seconds. Forward. Just. Good. Okay. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. ACA at a descent. Mode control both auto. Descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. 413 is in. We copy you down, Eagle. Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
At 2 hours, 56 minutes, and 15 seconds, 6.5 hours after landing, Armstrong stepped off Eagle's footpad and declared, "That's one small step for, man, one giant leap for mankind."
Okay, I just checked, getting back up to that first step. That isn't collapsed too far, but it's adequate to get back up. Roger, we copy. It's a pretty good little jump. Buzz, this is Houston. F2, 1/160th second for shadow photography on the sequence camera. Okay. At the foot of the ladder, the LEM footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine. I'm going to step off the LEM now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Apollo 11's landing was followed by Apollo 12, Apollo 14, Apollo 15, Apollo 16, and Apollo 17. Apollo 13 did not land, despite 100 hours of video, despite 1,000s of photographs taken using film cameras, despite hours of 16mm film taken in lunar orbit, despite tracking data, despite radio communication, despite television broadcasts, despite the building of 13 Saturn V's, despite the successful launch of 12 Saturn V's, despite the building of all the additional hardware, despite 400,000 people in both private and public industry working on Apollo over a period of 10 years, despite all this evidence, there are a small group of people who believe it was all fake. So if the USA, conducting their space program in front of the world's media, fake the first moon landing, and keep it secret for 50 years, why didn't the Soviet Union, conducting their space program in total secrecy, fake the first moon landing before the Americans? Many moon hoax believers state that the Soviets knew that all the Apollo moon landings were faked, but that they kept their mouths shut for 50 years, because they were dependent on US wheat. It's a nice tale of international blackmail, and quite untrue. The first moon landing took place on July 20, 1969. The 1972 Soviet-American grain deal took place a full 3 years after Apollo 11. The USSR had all that time to blow the whistle on the USA, and announce to the world that Apollo was fake, and that the US had lied. The Soviet-American grain deal of 1972 became known as the Great Grain Robbery. The July 1972 purchase of 10 million tons of United States grain, mainly wheat and corn, by the Soviet Union at subsidized prices, which resulted in higher grain prices in the United States. Food prices around the world rose 50% in 1973. Just weeks after this grain deal was announced, the Earth-observing satellite Landsat-1 achieved orbit. This led to the U.S. government seeking more information about global agricultural output via infrared satellite intelligence. The Soviet-American grain deal of 1972 was a disaster for everyone concerned, except the Russians, trying to make it the reason why the Soviets, who knew that the U.S. Apollo program was fake, kept quiet because they needed U.S. wheat is far-fetched. The Soviet N-1 rocket was ready in 1968. It was first launched on February 21, 1969. Its final launch took place on November 23, 1972. All 4 launches failed. 2 weeks later, the 6th and final Apollo mission landed on the moon. The N-1 program was cancelled. The Soviets failed to reach the moon because of the failure of their N-1 moon rocket. With the Saturn V, the Americans went to the moon 9 times between December 1968 and December 1972. They landed 6 times. Had the US been unable to reach the moon for all the usual reasons given by the moon hoaxers, the Soviets would have also known it was impossible to do. because they would not have been able to go for the same reasons. So they would have known that the US was going to fake its landing. Given that, there was no reason why they wouldn't choose to upstage the US and fake their own moon landing. The reason they didn't was because they knew the US landings were real. Attempting to fake a landing before the US actually landed on the moon would have been political suicide for all those involved.
An agreement they still keep to this day, with the two sides merely being pawns on the chessboard in the bankers' controlled opposition wars.
Mr. Armstrong, I do realize that when you were on the moon, you had very little time for gazing upwards. But could you tell us something about what the sky actually looks like from the moon, the sun, the earth, the stars, if any, and so on?
The sky is a deep black when viewed from the moon, as it is when viewed from cislunar space, the space between the Earth and the moon. The Earth is the only visible object other than the sun that can be seen, although there have been some reports of seeing planets. I myself did not see planets from the surface, but I suspect they might be visible. The Earth is quite beautiful from space and from the moon. It looks quite small and quite remote, but it's very blue and covered with white lace and of the clouds, and the continents are clearly seen, although they have very little color from that distance.
What about the sun? Could you see any trace of the corona?
No, the glare from the sun on the helmet visor was too difficult to pick out the corona. The only time we could see the corona was during an eclipse of the sun from the moon, that is when we were flying through the moon's shadow and could observe the solar corona peeking out from behind the moon.
Looking at the photographs that you brought back, the colored photographs of the moon's surface, it seems that the color of the surface actually varies according to the angle from which you see it. Is this so? Does it do this?
Yes, it certainly does. It's a characteristic that we observe first while traveling around the moon in orbit. You could see that at the terminator, at the boundary between the black part of the moon and the lighted part of the moon, it was as if you were looking at a television set with the contrast turned to full contrast, very black and very white. As you moved further into the light, there were more and more shades of gray. But as you moved further, such the sun was higher above the horizon, you actually start to see the tans and browns appear, although at a very low level. Similarly, on the surface of the moon, the same characteristic is evident. You can see browns if the sun is high enough. Apollo 12, for example, landed while the sun was only 5 degrees above the horizon. So when they arrived, they saw no browns or tans anywhere, only fairly high contrast grays.
But you did?
But yes, I did. The sun was at 11 degrees. And Apollo 12 did also the next day when they arose from their sleeping period and the sun was higher. Of course, then the browns were observable to them.
When you were actually walking about on the moon's surface and kicking about a certain amount of dust, did you notice any local color? And also, were you at all subconsciously worried about the possibility of unsafe areas?
Well, the color is a puzzling phenomenon on the moon, aside from the characteristics that I've already mentioned. You generally have the impression of being on a desert-like surface with rather light-colored hues. Yet when you look at the material at close range, as if in your hand, you find it's a charcoal gray, in fact, and we were never able to find anything that were very different from that color. I suspect that as we get more and more samples with future flights, we will see that there is, in fact, some color, but the optical properties on the moon are most peculiar.
When you were actually walking about, did you have any difficulty in distance judging? Because I think I heard you say once that far things looked quite near.
Yes, we had some difficulties in perception of distance. For example, our television camera we judged to be from the cockpit of the lunar module only about 50 to 60 feet away, yet we knew that we had pulled it out to the full extension of a 100-foot cable. Similarly, we had difficulty guessing how far the hills out on the horizon might be. The peculiar phenomenon is the closeness of the horizon due to the greater curvature of the moon than we have here on Earth, of course 4 times greater, and the fact that it is an irregular surface with crater rims overlying other crater rims. You can't see the real horizon. You're seeing hills that are somewhat closer to you. There was a large crater which we overflew during our final approach, which had hills of the order of 100 feet in height, and we were only 1,100 feet west of that hill, and we couldn't see a 100-foot high hill from 1,100 to 1,200 feet away.
Did you notice any obvious difference between the far side and the near side as you went around it? I mean, apart from the obvious differences in topography?
No observable differences in color, but then the sun's angle was always somewhat different over there, so it would be difficult to make a general correlation. I would say the topography is the striking change. Of course, as all your viewers know, there are no seas on the far side of the moon, and it's all highlands and high mountains, big craters. So it's strikingly different from the.
There's just one more thing I'd like to ask you. You're one of the very, very few people, I think, whose opinion on this is really worth having. In fact, there are only 4 of you. Do you think, from your knowledge of the moon, having been there, that it is going to be possible in the foreseeable future to set up scientific bases there on anything like a large scale?
Oh, I'm quite certain that we'll have such bases in our lifetime. somewhat like the Antarctic stations and similar scientific outposts, continually manned. Although certainly there's the problem of the environment, the vacuum, and the high and low temperatures of day and night, still in all, in many ways, it's more hospitable than Antarctica might be. There are no storms, no snow, no high winds, no unpredictable weather phenomena that we're yet aware of, and the gravity is a very pleasant kind of place to work in, better than here on Earth, and I think it would be quite a pleasant place to do scientific work, and quite practical.
Mr. Armstrong, thank you very much, and again, let me say what a tremendous honor and privilege it's been to have you with us.
Thank you.
Would you believe that they put a man on the moon?
Who? Who? These guys?
NASA.
Oh, NASA. Yes, yeah, I think they put a man
You
on the
believe
moon.
that?
Yeah.
I believe it.
Yes,
Yes.
you believe it. Good, that's all. That's sort of all at the end of the question, really. But you probably know that quite a lot of people don't believe it.
No.
Yeah, but, well, I sort of believe one thing,
Yeah.
which is I kind of believe that they might have done some mocked-up fake photographs.
Really, why?
Because I was showing... Someone convinced me of it.
Yeah.
by talking about the angle of light and the shadows on the moon and all that. But then I did an advert with Patrick Moore, and I said, "So, Patrick, did they land on the moon?" And he looked so annoyed with me.
Yeah.
Actually, he explained to me how he had helped map the moon for NASA, and he'd spent years on the project, and the landing site was partly his idea, and if I ever spoke to him again, he was going to be sick in my eyes.
They are rather tight. If you'd spoken to Buzz Aldrin, he might have punched you.
I was going to say...
Buzz Aldrin punched someone because he just got so tired of these conspiracy arses.